Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Today we will be talking about the evolving board pay and structure at public companies. This is the third of a three-part series relating to our Outlook webinar report. You will be able to download both the slide deck and the Outlook report from our resource list, and after the webinar, the recording of today's webinar will be made available to everyone who registered. I'm happy to be joined. My name is Aaron Boyd. I am the Director of Research here at Equilar. I'm happy to be joined by two outstanding experts, Lynn Joy, a Senior Advisor at Exequity, and Ted Dysart, a Vice Chairman at Heidrick & Struggles. We're pleased to have them, and we'll be going to them shortly as we look to get their expertise and thoughts about what's going on with the various issues that we're talking about today. Like I mentioned, this is the third of a three-part series. We talked about executive pay at the end of February, and 2 weeks ago we discussed corporate governance. Both webinars can be found, the recordings of those webinars can be found in the resource list. But today, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about the evolving board pay and structure. Really what we'll be looking at is all things board. That's our focus today, is to focus on boards. So often executives get all the attention, but the directors and their issues are sometimes put a little bit less of a priority than the executive issues. So today we're looking at boards as we're going into proxy season, and then obviously annual meetings where a lot of directors will be elected and a lot of these issues will be discussed and taken place. So as I mentioned, we have a great panel today, and so I'd like to jump into the agenda. Obviously there is a lot that we can talk about regarding boards. There's a number of issues, but due to our time constraint, we only have an hour. If we had a full day, I'm sure we could fill that up too, but we only have an hour, so we're going to focus on three specific topics. The first one is board pay, which we will focus on not only how much they're making, but why they're making that much and how that pay is being delivered to them, and discuss some of the implications around that. Secondly, we'll look at structuring the board and how boards are being run, looking at how they're set up from the types of committees they have to the leadership team that they have in place there. And then the third part will end with talking about who's on the board. We'll be looking at membership of the board and what are some of the director profiles and how has that changed over the last several years, and what are some of the reasons for that. So like I mentioned, we've got a great program today, and so we're going to jump right into it. And the first thing we're going to do is talk about board pay. And so let's look at some of the pay trends and some of the figures that we have regarding how directors are paid. Very simply, if you look at total director fees for the S&P 1500 and what the average amount is, these are numbers taken from the director compensation table found in the proxy statement. And again, we don't have the updated numbers for this proxy year, but looking at 2011 through 2009 through 2011, you can see that the average amount has gone up by a decent amount, over 10%, jumping from $140,000 a year to $166,000. And you can see that it's gone up the last couple of years, partly because the value of cash retainers, the average cash retainer has gone up, but also because of equity. So we're seeing the total pay package for directors go up on both sides, not only cash, but also the value of the equity awards that they're receiving. If we look at how this pay is being delivered to directors, and I'm going to bring in Lynn on this, you can see that the meeting fees really have seen a decline over the last 5 years. Retainers have remained very high, although increasing to 100% in 2011. You see that really the big trend is that meeting fees are starting to go away. And so, Lynn, I'm going to bring you in. You have a tremendous amount of expertise and experience in this area. what's going on with meeting fees? Why are they going down, and what are the implications of that?
Good question, Aaron. Well, the purpose, obviously, of meeting fees is to vary the director's pay based on the amount of work that was performed, which, sounds reasonable, hence is the reason that we've had meeting fees in the past. But as a result of a shift in the last few years, we've moved from having the director's pay package be attendance-based, if you will, to more role-based. It kind of reminds me of the difference in how we pay hourly employees versus salaried employees. As a salaried employee, you get paid the same salary whether you work 40 hours a week or 50 hours a week. But the reason for the shift more recently is based on a belief that all board members should attend all board meetings and all committee members should attend all committee meetings, so why calculate it separately? Which obviously has made whoever administers director pay within the company very happy, because it's easier to administer fixed retainers than it is to keep track of all those meeting fees. Plus, as you made reference to the director compensation table in the proxy, when you've got no meeting fees and you just have the retainer for the board service and the retainer for the committee services, you look at that director comp table and it presents more of a unified fee distribution when you look at the various directors at a given company. And when a company does switch from meeting fees, the use of meeting fees to away from a meeting fees, what they typically do is they'll roll, obviously, the pay attributed to those meeting fees. They just roll it into the annual retainer for the board or the annual retainers for the various committees. Now, there is a downside, as you mentioned. There is a downside to the elimination of meeting fees, and that is that the meeting fees, like I said at the beginning, allow us to adjust director pay for the amount of work. And sometimes we have unanticipated events that require the board or the committees or special individuals, to have more work. The solution for not being able to align then the pay with the extra amount of work is some companies will eliminate meeting fees up to a certain expected number. And if the number of board meetings or committee meetings goes beyond that expected number, well then, so let's say that if the board meets more than 10 times a year, then we're going to pay a $2,000, per board meeting fee. Well, then that provides an automatic adjustment to address that heavy board involvement that year. Maybe it's because of evaluation of a merger or acquisition transaction. Maybe it has to do with dealing with a financial crisis. And sometimes, we just have some sort of a crisis that means the board has to step up there. One story to share on this meeting fee front, and that is now all characters in this story are fictitious, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental.
Sure.
But imagine a situation where a company provides meeting fees to the directors for board meetings and comp committee meetings, and at this one particular company, management was joking that the directors were studying issues ad nauseum in order to maximize their meeting fees. Well, even though it's a joke, we all know that there's a grain of truth in a joke. So, just imagine a board member, how they would feel about management having the impression that they're trying to maximize through the meeting fees. So, a story for what it's worth, Aaron.
It's a great point. If you can find the equivalent to potentially like an hourly employee deciding to take their time on projects to maximize their hours and overtime, and like you said, it's a delicate balance for sure, because a grain of truth can sometimes cause problems there. Looking at the distribution of pay, and we don't have a chart here to talk about it, but obviously I mentioned earlier that the value of equity has been going up for directors, and a lot of that we're seeing a distribution for directors, which is similar to what we're seeing for executives and full-time employees, is the move away from giving options to the directors to full value shares. Lynn, why not give options to directors or instead of the full value shares, which is what most companies are typically doing?
Yeah, again, another really good question. And it really has to do with a difference in perspective as to what the director's responsibilities are in contrast to management. You know, management's job is to develop a business strategy and to execute operations relative to that strategy and therefore hopefully increase the value of the enterprise. And so management has a bonus that will be paid out based on great annual performance. We have a big resurgence of the use of performance shares, and if performance is great, well, then management will reap the benefits of the performance shares. And we do have stock options out there still for management, although obviously they've been scaled back considerably, and they're highly leveraged compared to full value shares. Now, in contrast, the role of an outside director is one of a fiduciary. You know, they have been elected by the shareholders to provide oversight on management, and therefore the risk-reward profile of the job and the compensation is different. Hence, even though we've had a decline in the use of stock options on the employee side, we've seen even more of a decline in stock options on the director side, given that belief that stock options are highly leveraged and more appropriate for management given their jobs as opposed to fiduciaries who should get full value shares like restricted stock, RSUs, deferred shares, or even outright shares to best align them with shareholders who they are the representative of.
Sure. That's a great point. And speaking of equity awards, if we look at initial membership awards, so typically, or one of the avenues that a board will have when someone joins the board is that they will grant a large equity award upon joining that. But you can see here from the stats that it's actually been going down in popularity from almost 30% back in 2007 to a very steady decline down to 23% in 2011. So, Lynn, bringing you back in here, what is the reason for that, and what are we seeing in terms of trends about distributing equity shares to directors?
Well, the nice part or the intention, again, of those initial equity grants is when a board member is first elected, to serve on the board, the reason for making that big initial equity grant is to provide them with that individual with significant stock ownership immediately. So they have that mentality that the long-term shareholders have as well. And so it used to be common practice to get an initial equity grant that was, say, 2 to 3 times the normal annual equity grant. Although, interestingly, we've seen a gradual elimination, as your data shows, in the use of an initial equity grant for a new member to the board of directors. And I really think that's sort of a function of the declining use of stock options. Normally those initial grants were that leveraged, we want the stock price to go up and we're going to gain in it, in the highly leveraged nature of stock options. You get more stock options than restricted shares, for example, given the accounting expense difference, given the value difference. And so I think because of that decline in the use of options generally for outside directors, I think that's why we've seen a gradual design in a gradual usage in the use of initial equity grants, because that is somehow to give a new director 3 times the normal full value share grant. I don't know. I think a lot of boards, whether it be the comp committee being responsible for director pay or the governance committee being responsible for director pay, they're not quite as comfortable giving, that level of full value shares as they were giving stock options. And for the reasons I cited before, stock options are being questioned as whether or not they're an appropriate vehicle for directors given their fiduciary duties. That said, there are some industries where initial grants to new directors are still common, such as, the innovation industries like high tech, biotech, pharmaceutical, medical devices, that kind of thing. That's where you'll see more of that initial grant of stock options for a new director.
Yeah, and this is Ted Dysart here. I think part of that is that many of those companies are still fairly early stage, even though that they're public. The other thing that I will say that I have seen from a recruiting perspective is more and more directors, when they join a board these days, probably approaching 10%, who are actually pulling out a checkbook and writing a check to buy shares when they join a company board, and that would have been unheard of about 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You're right. I think certainly there's been a push from a governance standpoint to make sure that not just executives but directors as well have skin in the game. One thing I'd like to bring up real quick and get Lynn, I'd like to get your thoughts on is performance shares obviously has been a big deal for executives and the move towards that. And you talked a little bit about the role of the director and how pay is structured around that. We've seen some high-profile companies, Coca-Cola for one, instituted performance shares a few years back for their directors. Is that something that we're going to see more of as there's a push for more pay for performance, or do we think that they're just going to maintain the restricted stock that they've been giving?
Yeah, well, God bless Coca-Cola for being a trailblazer there, although they ended up abandoning ship on that one. It was back in, I think it was 2006, when Coca-Cola put in a very much of an executive-looking performance share program, measuring performance over a 3-year period, and I think it was a target goal based on a certain EPS growth. And Coke had that for a couple years, and it was highly leveraged from what I remember. If they didn't perform well for that 3-year period, there was no director pay for them. And then Coke ended up, I think it was in 2010, they abandoned the performance shares and they put in deferred stock units instead. Deferred stock units being full value shares that the director can't sell until after they leave board service. So you've got the advantage with the deferred shares of having no taxes until you're off the board, which means you've got the appearance of holding more shares, just like the 401k works. And when Coca-Cola backstepped on the use of performance shares, I thought it was interesting in their public disclosure that they said that they believed that moving to deferred shares and away from the performance shares better tied their director's pay package to the shareholder interests, given their use of deferred stock units, because then their skin in the game would fluctuate both up and down. The downside with stock options is you don't feel the down necessarily, and that it made the deferred stock units were more longer term in nature because the directors held them until they left the board and presented a more equitable, were the words that Coca-Cola used, way to compensate directors for the effort that they put forth. So even though it's a neat concept, I think when it really comes down to what's the role of directors, and that is to be fiduciaries, I don't think we're going to see much in the way of performance-based pay after Coke's foray into it and the strong criticism that they got for that pay program.
Yeah, I've seen a number of a handful of articles written over the last couple of years regarding performance shares for directors, and I think the conclusion usually is about the same. From the director perspective, it just doesn't typically make as much sense. Moving on, there's a couple last points I want to get to in the board pay section before we move on, and that's the look of the role of pay for the board chair specifically. So when someone comes in who assumes additional responsibilities above and beyond being just the director, what sort of compensation are they receiving for that? And you can see the last 3 years, the prevalence of a cash retainer for chairman for a premium above and beyond what the directors are receiving has gone up a bit, and I think the importance of the CEO or the chairman role has increased over the last several years, and we'll get into that a little bit more in the next section. But looking at some more numbers, if you look at what the average multiple is for the board chair cash retainer relative to what the director is, so just to give you a sense of how much more it is, you can see that a large portion of the cash retainers are typically between 2 and 3 times what the directors are getting. So if the director fee is $50,000 for service on the board, then the overall fee for the chairman would be at approximately $150,000. You can see that there is a decent amount, 30%, that receive greater than 3x, and of course about a third get less than a 2x multiple. But I thought it was interesting to point out the differences in pay for chairs. And Lynn, I'd like to pose a question to you. Are you seeing a greater emphasis on paying the chairman role and making sure that they're compensated for duties as their role on the board has increased in importance?
Absolutely. Again, the objective here is to fairly compensate directors for the amount of time and effort that they need to put into the role, the amount of responsibility that's placed on them, and kind of the exposure. And, being a chairman of the board elevates all of those categories of reasons to increase their pay. And so, we've got, I think, about, a third of companies now who have a non-executive chairman of the board. And it's not too surprising that you see almost the one-third distribution of how much of a premium that board chairman, that non-executive board chairman is getting. I think that is a function of companies settling in on what is the extra value of that role. I think where you've got some of the more than 3 times everybody, the other board members, are situations oftentimes where that chairman of the board used to be the company's CEO, and so there's more going on there than just taking on that leadership role for the board of directors.
Sure. And Ted, let me bring you in real quick on one last point, and let me ask you, we're talking about the pay, and Lynn brought up the point of making sure that they're fairly compensated. From the standpoint of recruiting and people wanting to join the board, is pay really an issue? Is that something that goes into whether or not they'd want to join the board?
No, I think by and large what board members are really looking forward is being compensated fairly for their time. So they're going to want to know that for the size of the company, for the number of the meetings, and for the insight that they're being asked to bring to the table and the work that they're being put forward, that they're being compensated fairly within market. I think where companies struggle, and this is where some of the Welcome Aboard grants have really come into play, is where you have sort of early stage companies that are trying to attract talent sort of beyond their fighting weight, if you will. And so you look at some of the early stage tech companies and what they did with the Welcome Aboard grants. They knew they couldn't set their comp for the year in and year out at a level that was outside market, but to attract unique figures or unique people either just before going public or just after going public, that they created some opportunities for additional wealth creation. And that's where we think we've seen that sort of thing. But I often say if we're talking to a director and they bring up compensation, we're talking to the wrong person in terms of their overall interest and what their understanding of the role is.
Great, that's great. Well, why don't we spend a good amount of time on pay, and I want to make sure we're able to hit on the other points. So let's talk about structuring the board and what the board looks like in terms of activity and how they are setting themselves up with committees. And figuring out what they're doing from an operating standpoint. Looking at the classification of boards, and this is the issue of whether or not directors should be elected annually, and so the entire slate of directors having to stand for nomination every year, or is this something where you can do it every 3 years or every 2 years? If you look at it, you can see that it's really grown from being about 50% to about 60% now. And there has certainly been a big governance push from investors regarding declassification, and we've seen a number of proposals being put in the proxy requesting that boards with classified boards, in other words, that again the directors having to stand for election only once every multiple years, be taken to an annual situation. And I think certainly there's been traction on this regarding the how the board is structured and wanting more accountability. And moving into the leadership role, you can see here that about half of the companies that in the S&P 1500 have a combined CEO chair role or an executive chair role. So someone who's an employee of the company on the management side of things serving in chair. But there certainly has also been a large push from investors to separate out that role of the CEO and chair. I know recently there's been a push to separate the role of CEO and chair at a company like JP Morgan, which certainly had some issues last year. And Ted, let me bring you back in on this as far as from what you've seen with regards to either declassification or splitting out the role of the CEO and the chair. How are companies? How big of a concern is it for companies on these issues, and does that change sort of how they look at who's on their board?
Yeah, I look at the issue of lead director, presiding director, or non-executive chair, and I say, I almost don't care what you call it. It's a question more of, what is the role, how much time does it take, and how do the two parties interact with one another in their role for leadership, that being the CEO and the leader of the non-independent directors at the same time. And I think people's fear in many cases is that a non-executive chair will make more of the job than it needs to be, but I will tell you some of the very best non-executive chairs I've seen operate very similarly to a lead director. They just happen to have a little more respect based on the title. I think a lot of existing CEOs who are currently chairman and CEO feel like the removal of one of those titles will diminish their authority. And I think we see a lot more companies when they go through transition choosing to keep the two roles separate rather than keeping them combined. I think it is often, particularly the classified board is a lightning rod, for activist investors. And if you look at the data, where you see the continuance of a classified board or even more of a lightning rod of poison pill is where companies are really under threat. For acquisition, where they may have some odd governance structures or ownership structures that leave them vulnerable or leave them to be a target for other things. And I think this to me gets to the fundamental challenge of a board is when you engage a management team and when you develop an incentive plan or deploy capital, the question is you're looking for returns and over what period of time. And as we've seen with activist investors, there are those that come in and participate over the long period of time, like Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, but there are also quite a few other players who've gotten very active in the markets who have a fairly short timetable in terms of what they want to see in reactions. And I think it's that balance and that friction back and forth that comes to play around some of these key issues.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you mentioned that there are reasons for having a combined CEO chair, and I think certainly companies are, when being pushed about having either a declassified board or having a combined role of CEO and chair, companies are having to consider what to do, but typically they are coming out with, they'll stay with what they have, but just having to explain a little bit clearer why they have that structure in place and why they're doing that. But I think you're right. We'll certainly see investors continue to push for the separation of the CEO and the chair role, as I think a lot of times there's concern that having them combined will create governance issues. Although since about half the companies have the combined role, I think there's plenty of examples out there of very successful companies where the CEO is the chairman of the board, and that seems to go over well.
Yeah, I think the more challenging piece that we have seen with boards is how do you, in this structure, identify and recruit that independent board leadership. And not as we've gone into more specific skill sets, i.e. financial experts or looking for people with international experience or IT experience, and we've started to check the box in terms of skill sets, there are fewer and fewer of what I'll call sort of general infielders on the board. And while there may be an independent leader of the board today, in the form of a lead director or presiding director, a lot of boards are really struggling with today, how do we recruit those future people for leadership positions, and how do we develop them, and how do we think about succession planning in the boardroom at that next level the same way as we've started thinking about succession planning in the executive ranks.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think once we get to the membership side of things, we can bring that back up and talk about exactly what the types of directors are looking like, and you mentioned some of the shift in terms of who they're bringing in. And with the increase in bringing in the specialist, if you will, to do certain things, obviously we've seen an increase in the value of committees as a lot of their work has become more and more important. And if you look at the number of committees that boards have, of course, there's still the audit, comp, and governance committees that are standard and that exist at just about every company. But you also see a few more where up 34% have 4, and you can see even 12% have, or excuse me, 11% have at least 6 or more committees. So, and on those boards, obviously there's a lot to do, and so they have a number of committees and a number of people that they have serving in different roles focused on specific jobs. If you look at the number of meetings that they typically have, there's the audit committee, which has about 8 meetings a year, the compensation, which has about 6, and the governance, which sits at 4. Lynn, let me ask you, what are we seeing in terms of the importance of these committees and serving on the committees and what service looks like as far as impact and the amount of expertise that you need?
Yeah, well, and, it's helpful. Legislation does interesting things, right? The audit committee certainly became a bigger job when Sarbanes-Oxley came out circa 2002. And as a result, after Sarbanes-Oxley came into play, the compensation provided to audit committee chairmen and members, escalated pretty quickly so that we had alignment between, again, the increased time commitment, which you can see here from the average number of meetings, as well as the responsibility and the exposure that the audit committee now had as a result of Sarbanes-Oxley. Now, in the compensation committee arena, we obviously have increased scrutiny there as well. Dodd-Frank brought along the shareholder advisory vote on say on pay, and we also have the pressure exerted by proxy advisors like ISS and Glass Lewis, and the big institutional investors are becoming more and more demanding when it comes to executive pay, and as a result we're seeing an escalation of comp committee pay as well. Well, and the governance committee now is, I think, starting to have pressure of their own as we've got increased pressure on the expectations regarding the board, regarding governance and the rigor of the qualifications of the directors to serve. And you've got, obviously, the proxy advisors like ISS and Glass Lewis. If they're not happy with some aspect of governance, they'll recommend a withhold vote, when certain directors who are associated with that governance item are up for election. And there's nothing more embarrassing than having these high-integrity board members getting dinged, if you will, when it comes to re-election time. So I think we might even continue to see more of a shift in committee fees to recognize the increased responsibility and exposure of the audit, comp, and governance committees.
And you bring up, you do a great job of pointing out the shift from audit rising up as in importance and then compensation going up as well. And then, of course, there's a big governance push now where investors and boards are sort of reevaluating their activity, and I think just the emphasis on not just having a strong board, but also making sure that the board is focusing on the right things and playing a vital role in doing their jobs well and focusing on the ever-increasing number of items and issues that are being raised either through legislation and regulation like Sarbanes-Oxley and the Dodd-Frank bill, or just the issues that with say-on-pay obviously becoming a hot topic and something that every company has to deal with now, which now is providing a somewhat greater voice for the investors to bring up other issues beyond just the compensation. From the discussion we had 2 weeks ago in our previous webinar, where we talked about the relationship between the shareholder and the company's board and how that communication's increased. Not only is there conversations surrounding, well, how much is the CEO being made, but some other governance issues as well, which I think certainly is pushing boards to make sure that they are focusing on all of those things. So, with that, and I want to hit this last topic and give us plenty of time, and if we finish a little bit early, we'll try and answer some questions from anybody listening today. But the last thing I want to hit on is the membership on the board and how the look and the people that are sitting on the board of directors, who's serving as directors and in the various roles have changed. And Ted did a great job of talking about that earlier. But I wanted to look at how the dynamics are shifting and what is sort of your typical board. Obviously, it's important to understand the shifts because from a company's perspective, they want to know what sort of skills they should be looking for to help them keep up with the changing times and their changing customer base. And so, let's look at some of the stuff that's going on there. One of the big things we saw several years ago was the requirement by the SEC for companies to disclose the qualifications of their directors as far as why they should be serving on the board, what makes them serve on there. And we've got this, there's a great example in Dell's proxy that they filed last year that shows the disclosure, a nice table listing a number of areas surrounding their directors and what skills that they possessed, from having leadership and financial to international diversity and even executive experience in either the CEO or the CFO role. And this is an example you're able to pull out of our Insight product that looks at disclosure practices and the disclosure examples contained in there. And Ted, you mentioned a number of those things. What are you seeing as far as qualifications or certain skill sets in directors that boards are increasingly looking for and value more highly than they did maybe even a few years ago?
Well, I think there is a continued push to find people who are, either sitting CEOs, which is more of a challenge, or recently retired CEOs to serve on boards. Because at the end of the day, to me, a board of directors is a great gift to shareholders and to a corporation. I mean, to be able to have somewhere between 10 or 11 on average, supportive people helping a management team, try and look around corners and anticipate problems and advise the CEO is really a wonderful thing. And if we chart, for example, particularly the Fortune 500, so last year in the Fortune 500, a little over 48% of the new directors appointed were either sitting CEOs or former CEOs, recently retired, that were appointed to boards. And that, inherently, narrows down on some of the other, agenda items like, diversity, because if you, look at that sitting population, there's very little diversity in the CEO chair of the Fortune 500. If you look more broadly, There's a lot of focus on trying to find audit committee financial experts, and I think boards, back to my earlier comment about succession planning, are being more cognizant about bringing on audit committee financial experts with some overlap so that they can succeed the existing head of the audit committee. And we're also seeing a lot of pressure on trying to find people with international expertise. That's really looking at people who have lived and worked overseas, but just given the nature of travel and some of the challenges if a company, God forbid, ever goes into crisis, trying to find those people who are back here in the U.S. So we're either looking at people who had international responsibilities and have moved back here to the United States, or in some cases trying to find people who are living here in the U.S. running what would be Fortune 500 companies in their own right, but that are divisions of non-U.S. companies, and those people who have had formidable business formation experience outside the U.S.
Yeah, thanks, Ted, and a great point about all the different stuff that they're looking for. And it's interesting that the CEO, I mean, certainly not unexpected, but obviously the importance of having that CEO experience certainly helps. Looking at, and you talked about looking for new directors. If we look at turnover rates in terms of the number of directors that depart the S&P 1500 boards over the last 3 years, it's been about 9%. And so typically if you've got a board of about 10 people, you'll see approximately one leave every year. And so obviously having to deal with that turnover and replacing those individuals. If you look at the number of companies that deal with turnover, you can see that from a large cap perspective, the large companies, the S&P 500, face much greater, are more likely to see at least one director leave than a small cap, although all three of the sizes will have typically at least 50% of the companies will see a director leave. Now, a lot of the change in the percentage is because the large cap companies will have larger boards, and so they're more likely to see more turnover there. But Ted, let me bring this back to you, and you mentioned a little bit about the difference between large cap companies and small cap. Is having the governance committee and making sure that you've got a pool of talent that you can reach out to and bring on to either replace those who lost, people you lost, or expand into different areas that you need. And obviously, working at Heidrick and Struggles, your job is to find those individuals and finding good fits. What do you see as the differences between large cap and the smaller companies as far as trying to worry about who to bring on to the board?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, if your first criteria is being in a community of your peers and running organizations of, size and scale that is similar to the institution that you would go on the board of, as you get to large cap companies, the pool gets smaller very quickly. We've seen more of an openness and more of, on both sides really, to people who are large divisional managers. I alluded to earlier, there are large companies like a Procter & Gamble, for example, where they have numerous people who are running businesses who would be Fortune 500 companies in their own right, 20, 30, $40 billion P&Ls. And an openness to places like there and GE and others to allowing their executives to serve on outside boards. I think the CEOs in their own boards have finally recognized that not only are they contributing to the development of those other companies, but they're getting some growth when they bring it back to their own company. And particularly as boards are looking at the issue of succession planning, they're saying here are 2 or 3 people, Heidrick, that we think would benefit in their development from an outside board opportunity. And so we're seeing some depth in the pool from something like that. Likewise, somebody at a small cap company, if you're a $400 or $500 million company, while it may look good in your proxy and from a prestige standpoint to have someone who's running a $10 billion enterprise on your board, I can tell you from experience working with boards and management teams that those people do not bring the same toolkit and the same experiences to the table, and sometimes struggle with the lack of resources and how you need to, sort of bootstrap a company and move it forward. So I'm very much of the mindset that there are horses for courses, and I think it's incumbent on a nominating and governance committee each year, when people are up for election, to say, hey, look, we recruited you onto our board 10 years ago when this company was a $2 billion company. Today we're a $10, $12, $15 billion company, and are your skills and experiences necessarily relevant today? They may or they may not be, and I think every time a person is up for re-election, it's important on the nominating and governance committee to go through an evaluation process and really ask themselves that hard question. And I think that's where boards often struggle, is saying, hey, look, he or she was a great contributing board member, but it's time for them to move on to create some turnover, to get some fresh blood into the boardroom as we look forward and look not on where we are today, but where we're going to be 3 or 5 years from now. And in some of these boardrooms today, that may be looking for people who could be in their 30s, who are shaping some of the world in the social media area. We do get some requests in and around that. Or it may be finding on a larger trajectory or with that global experience in terms of where a company is going.
Sure, and you mentioned a little bit about just the wide range of the types of people that you could potentially bring in and that they're looking for to add to the board from a skill set standpoint. And a lot of that is a focus on diversity, which I know has been a big topic, not just, and we have some information here, some data on looking at the breakdown of gender, and you can see that, for example, at this point, almost a quarter of S&P 1500 boards don't have any female directors on there, and the prevalence of having females on the board has certainly become somewhat of a hot topic. You can see here that we are seeing progress as far as the number of women getting on boards over the last several years, going from the number that don't have any on their board is going down to the number that are that have at least 3 or more is going up in all the other categories as well. So I think we're certainly starting to see a shift there, at least from a gender perspective. If you look at the European Union and what they're doing, they're looking at not quite yet requiring, but certainly pushing companies to have at least 40% representation on their board as far as females are concerned, and representation. But when we talk about diversity, I mean, certainly gender is one of the hot topics, but I think what we've been talking about here, and I think what you'll hear out there from companies and from boards specifically, is that the need for diversity extends well beyond just whether or not it's a male or a female on the board, but perspective, experience. Do they have that IT knowledge, or do they have that CEO experience, and things that go well beyond just a certain checkbox that the person may or may not have. If we look at the typical director and some of the stats around there, you can see that your typical director is about 60, a little bit over 60, so they're close to retirement age. The youngest being, of course, Ivanka Trump at Signature Banks, and she's at 30, and then the oldest being Mortimer Kaplan at Danaher, who is still at 95, going strong, and the company's happy to have him on their board. And let me ask you, Ted, this. You talked about there's a need for a more diverse board, and so people are looking for this greater set of skills. One, is there a dearth, or is there a lack of people that are able to fit all these requirements, or is there a surplus? And are you seeing a number of people reaching out to you asking to try and be on boards, and there's certainly a number of willing people who are maybe using tools like Equilar's Atlas tool to find ways to network and get onto boards? Are you seeing boards finding enough qualified people, and are there enough people raising their hand saying, I want to be on a board?
Well, I would say, for almost every board search that we do today, our clients are interviewing 2 or possibly 3 candidates that, they tell us they feel are qualified. So that answers the question of a qualified pool. I think we've seen more people of color and women, breaking through the glass ceiling and moving to higher levels of a corporation. That's not to say that there's not a lot more work to be done. Around the issue of European quotas, I was over in Davos at the World Economic Forum, and I think it was Christine Lagarde that said, I don't like quotas, but I like what they accomplish. And so, people are looking to push the issue, from a quota perspective here in the United States, but I think there is a continuation to say we've got to keep challenging ourselves to make the boardrooms and our C-suites more diverse, not because of diversity for diversity's sake, but because diversity really does make a stronger board and a stronger corporation. I think where people get into trouble is where they make compromises around qualifications for those. I mean, we commit to our clients that we're going to present a diverse slate for each and every search that we do. And hopefully in those situations, if they're all qualified, all things being equal, the tie goes to the runner, so to speak, or the tie goes to the diverse candidate. And we see time and time again where clients will jump at the opportunity to add diversity to their board if they're presented with a qualified candidate. And I think we simply have to keep challenging ourselves around that issue. I think one of the other challenges that we have is that early on around the issue of diversity, because of the pool of candidates that were made available, many companies made compromises. If you were a woman, or a person of color, and you were running a $500 million or $1 billion P&L, you might find yourself on the board of a Fortune 100 company, and you were no longer in a community of your peers. And I think there's an uncomfortable conversation to be had where, I go out and sit down with what is often an elderly white male, and you bring up the issue of diversity, and the answer I get frequently is no thanks, we've got one of those. And I think that data is reflected, in the material that you have here, that there are lots of boards that have one woman or have one person of color, and they're not honest about the fact that there are a lot more really talented people that are breaking through those glass ceilings who could be great contributors to a board here going forward.
Is there things that an individual can do to reach out and try to get on the board? I mentioned Equilar's Atlas tool, which certainly allows people to figure out how they can get connected to companies and boards and who they know. But, is there something that obviously the company would reach out to you and use you to help try and recruit good people, but is there something that maybe a person who's looking to get on the board that they can do to help either make themselves more attractive or make it so that they're more visible as a potential candidate?
Well, I mean, I think like anybody working their way up in their career, first and foremost, do a good job, at your day job. And those that rise to the top are those that deliver results for their corporations. And if you look at the boardrooms today, the fastest to get onto another company's board is to work your way into the C-suite running a large P&L, at your company. Beyond that, I think, making sure that you're not too known at your own company and building your network outside the organization, being involved in trade organizations and those sorts of things. Obviously, wherever there are, rankings for either the best companies or the best managers or the best CFOs, those end up being resources that boards and search firms use in terms of identifying potential candidates. And then building your network with people who serve on boards today. One of the best ways that, I think people can find themselves on boards is engaging their own company's board and asking for their help in trying to find that next opportunity so that, when I call someone who might already be on 2 or possibly 3 boards and they say they're just too busy and can't do something else, that they recommend you to me. But I think where people struggle is that there are people who get advised to write directly to companies, and I think that's a knock against you and just shows that you don't really understand the recruiting process to write to, corporate secretary or nominating and governance chair and propose yourself. And there's a burgeoning business where, some of the former people from our industry are trying to get companies or individuals to pay them to try and help them find a board seat. And I'm not sure what the success has been, on that side, and it comes with a pretty substantial fee at the same time. So, I think you just need to be careful about that.
Sure. Well, that's an interesting point, and it looks like we're almost out of time. I'd like to put on here a quick survey for all the attendees. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get to answer all the questions, but if everybody in attendance could fill this out, that would be helpful for us, and so we can know how we can provide you better. I'd like to thank both Lynn and Ted for not only the generosity of their time, but also their great insights in this topic. I'm sad to end this webinar because there's a whole lot more that I'd love to talk about, but I know we have time and we all have a lot of work to get back to. So Lynn and Ted, thank you so much for your effort and your thoughts on these. And to everybody who listened in, hopefully you found this both useful and entertaining, and best of luck in all your projects going forward.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you very much.